All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to do this one on the comfy of my little sofa bed here because I'm lazy today. So I'm going to kick back, and there's like Amazon boxes and stuff stashed behind there. So yeah, you guys can complain about the mess, but I want to be lazy today. So I'm going to get comfy, and we're going to chat for a bit as I lay here. Yeah? You can tell how much I really care about the surroundings because I just go. Today I want to talk about pros and cons of remote studios. So, we've talked a little bit in episodes 1 and 2 about, bootstrapping and why we did what we did and where we are. This is a really comfy sofa bed, by the way. My wife and I usually sit here when we watch TV because I got my office set up over there on the other corner. So, anyway, the content of these videos is what's important, not the visuals at this point in time. Like I said, I'm not a professional streamer. I'm just putting these out there for people to listen to and who want to pay attention. So, anyway, remote studios versus physical studios. So, pros and cons we've already discussed briefly is when you're working remote, you can do it for a hell of a lot cheaper than needing an office space. But there obviously are some cons associated with that, mostly related to the infrastructure and also co-working. So there's something to be said for cohesiveness when everybody's working together in the same space, and also that day-to-day productivity. You can get a lot more done when it's just a matter of walking across the room to someone else's desk, as opposed to trying to schedule a sit down with someone who may or may not be in the office, in their home office at the time that you need them. Even if you're working quote unquote office hours, I will say that as a general rule, myself, John, and Bobby tend to communicate on a daily basis just as we would in an office setting, but we're also unique in that the three of us are working from home, and so we can very quickly and easily do that. It's not necessarily going to be the case, and it's definitely not the case with the rest of our team members who are only home in the evening hours and are working at nights outside of their day jobs, and which are taking place in a physical office. And that could be a little trickier because, for example, myself, Bobby, John, because we're working throughout the day, at night, we're typically a little bit occupied with dinner time with our spouses and or children enter into the picture. For John, for example, that could be a bit challenging when you have other team members who are working in the evening hours and they're trying to have meetings with you. So we have our weekly meetings that happen on Wednesday nights, and then there's day-to-day stuff, and then if we need to set up meetings, I think like the world building meeting happens on like a Saturday, then we have a community manager meeting on Fridays, and then there's I can't remember the other meeting that takes place. We have multiple meetings throughout the week based on the needs of all the individual team members, but you definitely do lose out on that productivity of just being able to get up from your chair, walk to somebody else's chair, and that's it. I apologize, my nose is still stuffy. I'm still getting over all the forest fire stuff, so I've got sinus issues and all sorts of fun. The cough is starting to subside, which is good, but I'm still stuffy. Anyway, so obviously your costs are lower because you don't have an office, but you do, like I said, there's a lot of workarounds for the productivity. The other thing that is tricky with remote is the handling of files. Not necessarily files per se, but with an MMORPG in particular, you need to be move my hand here because that one's getting tired. You have to worry about like if you've got a world builder who uploads a zone, and then you've got an artist who's putting art into that zone, and then you need to get it back to the world builder, and then the world builder needs to get it to the technical artist, and the technical art. As it goes through the pipeline, it's not just as simple as uploading it to, say, a Dropbox account. you have to have something where, you know, you're dealing with your version control, and also, you know, you want those changes to be accessible on the fly, so that as the artist is making changes to that zone, the world builder can see those changes in real time. And that's very easy when you're in one office and you're sharing everything in that local space. But when you're working remote, it's an entirely different subject matter. And that's, you know, I think learning how to use Git for everybody in the team who is part of that project has been one of those extra hurdles that we wouldn't have to deal with had we been doing this in a physical office space. So, things to think about, you know, pros and cons of remote versus having physical office. Yeah. So the other thing too, this goes back to when I was talking the other day about the choosing wherever, if you are working remote, choosing a place that has a decent internet connection. At various points in time, because of travel, when I was still working with the travel brand, there would be times when I would be off in the middle of nowhere, and I would maybe have a 3 or 4 or 5 megabyte connection with like a 1 megabyte up. And that could be a really big challenge when you're dealing with these, you know, 5 gigabyte files for zones and stuff. And it's just one of those situations where you can't realistically work on a project remotely unless you have fiber. I mean, you really got to have fiber, and you really should have gigabit service. I mean, and it's weird because in the US, you know, specifically, you deal with a lot of places where you can go to a city and they'll have like, oh yeah, we have gigabit service, so it's 1,000 down, but then it's only like 50 up. It's not great, but it's also not the worst, and you can definitely work on that kind of a connection. Where I live in Mexico City, I have a 200 down, 200 up. And then if you're lucky enough, to live somewhere where you've got Google Fiber, you can get, you know, 1 down, 1 up, a gigabyte down, gigabyte up. And that's the ideal scenario, is to be in a place where you can get that type of service. But I would say the minimum upload you would need is 25 megabytes, because that way, you know, on a 25 megabyte, you'll be able to upload bigger files. You know, it might take a little while, but it won't be overnight. I can remember times when I was off in the middle of nowhere where I had to, you know, upload like a 3 gigabyte file, and it was literally just leave the laptop on and go to bed, because it was going to take 9 or 10 hours to upload that file. And that is not an ideal scenario, by the way. But it, you know, it is what it is, and you make it work. So, pro to having an office is that cohesiveness and that co-working and that productivity. But the downside to that, which we've briefly talked about before, is the costs of having an office. If you rent, especially like in Austin, where our offices are, or our headquarters are, we don't really have an office. You know, you're looking at, for a team of 15, you're going to need an office space that is going to cost you around $8,000 to $10,000 a month. Once you factor in the lease, insurance, bonding, internet, all the other stuff that goes along with that. And you're also going to be locked into typically like a 3 to 5 year lease. Like, you're not going to be able to find stuff where you can just rent for like 1 year. They're going to want to lock you in. And the market in Austin in particular is extremely cutthroat when it comes to office space. There are other places where it's much cheaper, and we've looked at all those places, but we still haven't found anything that's, you know, remotely close to being what we would consider affordable for our company and our team. And again, this goes back to what I was talking about in the bootstrapping episode, where unless you've got, you know, unless you've got a few $1 million sitting around that you can afford to just throw away on rent, you know, and obviously it's a tax deduction, you know, it's a write-off, but it's also going to cost you a lot of money over a 3 to 5 period window of time. So when you look at that $8,000 to $10,000 a month, that's money that you could pay an engineer to be doing something. And this is when you also have to kind of like measure, because if you do have an office space and you're getting heightened productivity from everybody, then people are theoretically doing more with their time than they would be working remote. Because working remote, there's going to be a lot of time dealing with the upload and download of files and and all this other stuff. And whereas if you're in the same office, you cut that out of the equation, so you're getting more for your money in the sense that everyone is producing more. So you just have to be able to do the math on your own and figure out for your particular company's needs, is it going to be worthwhile for us to do remote or an office? Because there are pros and cons to all of that. And at the end of the day, everybody's financial situation is unique. And you have to be able to balance that out and say which one's going to work for us the best. Now, there's also something we said for you do not have to form an LLC in the state that you live in, nor the city that you're based out of. There are a lot of game companies who are based out of Delaware for tax purposes, but their physical offices are somewhere different. We went ahead and just did everything in Austin because we literally didn't know a lot about all these tax scenarios. And I talked about this in another video. It came down between Montreal, Mexico City, and Austin just because we wanted to be where there was talent and some other things, and it worked for us because we had a team member who was already going to be there on the ground. So Austin worked for us. But there are other places which may or may not be better for you. The key thing to remember is that you don't have to live wherever you're based. You can have your LLC be anywhere. It could be based in the Virgin Islands. It can be based in France. It can be based in Bulgaria. It doesn't matter where your company is based. You can live and work wherever. You can set up your office wherever you want to set up an office and have people working there in the local environment. So the big thing for you is going to be looking at what makes sense for our LLC or S Corp or C Corp, whatever you decide your structure is going to be. What's best for our company, and then, can we afford to do it where we're at, or do we need to be remote? Something else to think about, and I may have mentioned this in the bootstrapping video. I don't quite remember if I did. In the Polygon article where I was talking about, actually that might not have been that was the bootstrapping episode. In the Polygon article that's linked in that bootstrapping discussion over on Patreon, there's some unique scenarios in there where, like the guy who got the little 84 square foot cabin, but then there's also the group of 3 guys who just rented this house together. And that's something to think about, is that if you're in a scenario where you don't have to worry about kids and significant others, and you like the people you're working with, and you want to get together and rent a residential building where you're all just going to live and work for the course of, however many years it's going to take you to develop your game, that's totally feasible. Consider this, though. It's one thing to work with people for 8 hours a day and have that camaraderie, and it's another thing entirely to live with people on top of working with them. Those of us who are married know that there's a different dynamic when you're living with someone 24/7. We all love our spouses dearly, but there are always going to be moments in any relationship where it's like, I love you, but I don't like you right now. For whatever reason, we just had an argument, and, when you're married, that's just part of being married. You work that out. When you're not married to these people and you're just working with them, but you're working and living with them, there are scenarios that can arise that as adults, you should be able to work your way through, but not everybody acts like adults at all times. We're all guilty of temper tantrums and letting, frustration or anger or whatever get in the way of thinking clearly. So you really need to know that you're going to be able to handle living with people on top of working with them for a period of years if you're going to do a scenario like that. But it is something where you can find plenty of 5-6 bedroom homes anywhere, really, for, a reasonable amount of money. I'm not going to quote things because it's going to depend on where you're at and all this other stuff. But, if you can get a 5-bedroom house for $1,500 a month, and there's 6 of you living there, and you're splitting that 6 ways, or 5 ways, whatever the case may be, excuse me, and you've got a 3-year lease on that place, and that's the time you need to develop your game, that can work, and you can have that be your home office as well as your workspace. The key to this is that there's a lot of different regulations and laws on residential versus commercial space. And there's nothing wrong, there's no laws against working from home, but there's a reason why, for example, if I'm running an electric company, I'm an electrician, I can't have a fleet of vehicles parked outside of my home if I live in a subdivision, because the homeowners association, all the zoning laws and all this other stuff are in place for that kind of, to prohibit that kind of stuff. So if you want to have a fleet of vehicles, you have to have a commercial space where you're going to be storing those vehicles, and also a commercial office. You cannot be running that type of an enterprise out of a residential building. But you can have a work from home. Anybody can work from home. The key is that you can't be doing commercial stuff out of that residential address, because there are zoning laws against it. So for example, you can't be having a pallet of boxes arrive every week, because that's just one of those things where, not just the zoning laws and restrictions, but also the homeowners association and other stuff. People live in those areas. These are subdivisions, residential zoning areas, and so commercial enterprises, they don't want that commercial traffic in there. It's not a warehouse district. So it's one thing if you're only dealing with digital goods like we are, you can totally do that. But if you're doing physical goods, you're going to have some sort of a studio space or an office space that is outside of a residential area. And on the flip side of that, there's also zoning restrictions and laws where you're not allowed to be living in the commercial space. So there's one thing, sleeping over at the office every now and again, once or twice a week. We've all read about Elon Musk doing this multiple times. But you can get lines start to be crossed when you've got people living in commercial spaces, because they're not zoned for residential services. So you don't have, there's just all these rules and regulations and zoning laws and restrictions that you have to pay attention to, depending on how you're going to be setting up this space. Now there's interesting scenarios where, like in big cities, you can get warehouse spaces where you can convert like the upper loft into an apartment. But again, you have to get the permits for that kind of stuff. So just pay attention to that. If you're lucky enough to actually own real estate, then you can just convert that however you want into a studio space or some sort of an office to use. Another thing to think about in the remote versus physical office thing is there are restrictions in place. For example, when we went to apply for the tax credits for Austin-based entertainment companies, we unfortunately, we moved. One of the reasons we decided to go to Austin was because of the system that they had in place. And then, like the year after we got there, they completely just changed the system and significantly reduced the amount of money to where it was kind of negligible. But one of the things that we found out after we'd already moved there and already set up our LLC was that, well, technically you can't apply for that unless you have an actual office address in Austin. And all we had was a residential address physically in Austin, but you have to have a commercial office space, I believe, with the restriction at the time, and you had to have been there for a minimum of 12 months. So we didn't fit the criteria in any one of those situations, so it was like, well, I guess we can't apply for tax credits. Things to think about. Being remote also, I can tell you this much, for us, in the early days, didn't really matter because we were doing everything digital. Now, once we started dealing with, so when we started bringing on investors, there was just give you some insight. Again, I'm not getting into financials, but talking to the banks and setting up the different accounts and everything and making sure that all our ducks in a row for taxes and all this other stuff, it became very quickly that the banking systems don't like it if you don't have a physical place that you're using as an office in a home where they can get a hold of you easily, where they can send mail and all this other stuff. So ultimately we decided on using one of our residential addresses for our home base up in the United States to fulfill those requirements. But also, it's a good thing we did, because then when we started fulfilling the physical, which we actually made sure very early on that we said we don't want to deal with the shipping costs, because that ruins a lot of companies, especially Kickstarter campaigns, they don't factor in shipping costs for physical goods. So we said the only pre-order on our store that's going to have physical goods is the collector's edition, and that's only going to have a book and a cloth map attached to it. So the other thing of needing to have some sort of an address and or storage space is that, once, we're actually in the process right now, because we closed down the pre-order store in March of 2019, and then we ordered all of the collector's edition books that I'm going to be signing later this year. And then we also are fulfilling the cloth maps right now. Well, all that stuff has to get shipped to this place where we're storing everything, and you have to have storage space, and you have to have an address where it can be delivered. So things to think about, because even if you are a remote team, there is still going to be a need for some sort of physical space, whether it's just for mail, whether it's for the banks, whether it's for investors, whatever the case may be. There needs to be a physical address. It can't be a P.O. box. It's got to be a physical address where somebody actually lives. An actual phone number that can be answered when calls need to be made. There have been multiple times, like, PayPal, the banks, etc. They're going to need to call to verify something for security purposes. And there needs to be a number that they can call. There needs to be an address where they can send official documentation. All this stuff you have to factor this in even if you are a fully remote team. So the tricky part of this is, like, for example, because I'm in Mexico City, I don't get anything shipped here because it's too much of a hassle to deal with international shipping and all this other stuff. So we're using one of our US-based partners on the team, and that works out great. But again, it's one of those things where if your whole team is based out of, Sri Lanka or Mexico, South America, but your company's based in, I don't know, Denver, Colorado, you're going to need some place in the United States where you're going to be able to receive mail and ship things, because you're not going to, the banks and stuff are not going to let you do all that if you're over living somewhere else. There's the other thing, which we may actually have an episode about this later on now that I'm thinking about it. When it comes to business realities, accounting, legal, all of this stuff on the back end, you're going to find very quickly that if you are based in the U.S. but you're not living in the U.S., that throws red flags up for people. So you have to make sure that you've got all your ducks in a row, and that you're not just permanently not there. Because again, you'll need to be getting mail and phone calls and stuff like that. So anyway, yeah, it's one of those things where we're lucky in that the majority of our team is from the U.S., so we kind of fulfill all of those things. And myself, and we have other people on the team who don't live in the U.S., but because the bulk of our team does, we're okay in that regards. But it does throw up some red flags. We've talked to some publishers who are like, well, hang on, you're based in Austin, but you've got a team member in Belgium, and you got a team member in Canada, and you got a team member in Australia, and you got a team member in Mexico, and that just seems a little weird. Like, why aren't you all in one place? And that's making red flags for us. And there's still a lot of people who don't trust remote right now, despite the fact that we're in the 21st century. So this is one of those things where you may get some pushback, because people are going to want to have a physical office that they can. It's a security thing for some reason. For some people, they see a physical address, a physical location, as something that they can trust. It's a thing. It's a tangible object. It's a tangible office. It's a space where they can go. It's an address they can contact. It's a phone number that's always going to be picked up, that kind of stuff, as opposed to only email, which, you can be answering email from anywhere on the planet. So it's one of those weird things with remote. Some people still push back against it. But, yeah, pros, cons, costs versus productivity. For us, we use Slack for our day-to-day, Discord with our community, and also we do Discord videos. We do Hangouts, which I think are getting phased out this year. Google Hangouts, I think now it's Google Meet. We use that for our big team meetings every Wednesday night. internally. You know, we've got all of our own emails and everything else, but the day-to-day stuff happens in Slack. And then, you know, we have our own servers now, but in the early days we didn't have our own servers, so we were relying on cloud storage for a lot of stuff. So, you know, we had a Mega account and a Dropbox account and a Google storage. You know, we had 4 or 5 different accounts set up around the place. But then when we picked up our own servers and racks and everything else, we have our own unlimited storage space, so we store everything on our own. You can also go into the cloud for a lot of stuff, like I said, which we did in the early days, but it's better once you get your server set up, you can have all your own stuff. That's the other thing, remote versus physical. Cloud storage is a great thing, and it's very flexible, and you can do it from anywhere in the world. Cloud storage is also expensive. It is more expensive. Cloud storage is more expensive, and cloud servers are more expensive than physical servers. But in order to have physical servers, you have to have a location that you can go to regularly or live in the area of, so that you regularly have access to it. You can also run your own servers out of your home. I don't think I would recommend that though, because of you have to be in a gigabyte area where you've got gigabit service. And also you need a separate room because servers are loud, they cause a lot of heat. It's not an ideal scenario to have storage racks in your home. So co-location facilities are great, especially if they've got 24/7 round the clock service, so that if you're not there for some reason and something goes down, there's you have somebody there who can take care of things. Anyway, I can't think if there's anything else I need to cover in this episode about pros and cons of working remote versus having a physical office. I can say from a personal experience that I do miss. It is very nice having the camaraderie that happens, and also there's a lot of stuff we miss out on by working remote. For example, I would love to be able to like play D&D with my teammates and play PlayStation on like a Friday night or something, when we're getting off work, and just hang out and chill and be able to go over and have barbecues and hang out with everybody's families and all that other stuff. And you don't get to do that when you're remote, so it can make the team a little less personal than it is when you're working together in the same space. It also takes a certain mentality to be able to work from home and be productive, because you are your own boss, and it's not that easy. I mean, a lot of people think that working from home is this dream job. When you start working from home and working remote, it is more of a challenge, because you're not when you go to a job and you're clocked in and you're in that space, it's very easy to stay motivated because you know you're there from 9 to 5. And when there's nobody else at your house and it's just you, and you're here in this empty office, and there's no one else like tapping you on the shoulder or keeping you accountable, you're the only one who's doing that. And so a lot of people just can't handle that responsibility because they get sidetracked. It's like, well, I'm going to take a 30-minute break and I'm going to watch Netflix, or I'm going to go play a video game for 20 minutes, and that turns into 2 hours, and then it's like, oh shit, I got to get this other stuff done, and then 2 hours becomes a daily thing, and then it's a scenario where working remote is great if you're responsible enough to handle that, because it does come with its own set of responsibilities and communication limitations. So these are all things to keep in mind. Don't forget, you can read more about remote versus teams in the Patreon post, which is linked below in the description. Don't forget to subscribe. One of these, I always forget which way it is. It doesn't really matter. Hit the subscribe button on YouTube. Hit the bell notification. Get notifications if we're going live. Don't forget, we are working on lots of fun stuff over at the Saga of Lucimia, so check out all the links if you're interested in that. We're getting ready to do World of Warcraft Classic here in a few months, Alliance side, so if you want to join us for that venture, we're going to be doing a raid guild Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, 8 p.m. Central onward. So get involved with that if you want to, and also check out all the other stuff going on my Patreon. I've got excerpts from the novels, art snippets, and the book club, and some other stuff. So thanks, guys, for tuning in. Stay tuned for the next episode. Safe gaming. And as always, if you have questions, comments, etc., put them down below, and I'll get them answered. Until next time.